Okay, we continue this week with population geography, shaping the human mosaic. Population geography represents the study of spatial and ecological aspects of population. Things such as distribution, density per unit of land area, fertility, gender, health, age, mortality, and migration. All very important themes that we see playing out on the world stage right now in very severe manners, especially in terms of mortality and migration. Migration, for instance, in the Mediterranean area, or even here within North America in the news a lot. The authors point out that if Western lifestyles are adopted by a significant number of the Earth's 7+ billion inhabitants, we may soon deplete or contaminate Earth's life support systems. So this is an important precursor to the discussion of population geography and highlights some of the importance of why we take such a close look, full unit here at population. So working through our 5 themes as we do week by week, providing a great framework to understand population geography. We'll first take a look at population distribution and density, a simple measurement of the population per unit area. And it's important to keep in mind that people are very unevenly distributed. We'll see a map of that in just a second here. And this creates large disparities or differences in density. And also it's interesting to note that almost 20% of humans reside in China, over 1.4 billion people now. About 17% of humans in India and only 4.4% in the US, even though we're responsible for much larger percent of resource use and carbon dioxide emissions, greenhouse gases. So here's a map of the population density in the world. You can see 3 main clusters that are encircled in the black lines: the East Asian to the southwest of there, Indian subcontinent cluster, deep purple zone spanning almost the entire subcontinent of India, and then also the European cluster, particularly high densities in England, Germany, and some other interesting spots to note, such as southern Mexico or around the Great Lakes region of US and Canada. Here we have a basic graph of the demographic transition. Demography is the study of populations, and the transition here maps out 5 different stages that are generally thought to correspond with pre-industrialization up through the various scales, levels of industrialization, and even now into, in some areas, what's known as the post-industrial period, where death rates are outpacing birth rates and there's a declining total population. So this is actually the case in Canada, in France, and in these 2 countries. They actually pay, in France in particular, they pay women to have more children. And just to the north of us in Canada, there's a lot of emphasis put on increasing immigration to help national population numbers. So the shortcomings of this transition model that we'll look more at center around how it's Eurocentric, reflects the experience of Western Europe in particular, and also that it's a lockstep, stage-by-stage progression. And it's important to keep in mind that not all countries go through these stages the way it models. It's a model. It's not an exact science, if you will. Government policies, wars, mass migrations, widespread disease, etc., can severely alter a country's experience and or their trajectory, for that matter. What does provide a really unique insight into population models are the pyramids that we'll take a look at here, the population pyramids for the world and selected countries or even communities. We can see how different genders are mapped and the age distribution up through different decades of ages. And these are really important for demographers and geographers in general for understanding the outlay of populations. So population pyramids, to sum it up, is a graph used to show age and sex composition of a population. They reveal past progress of birth control and allow geographers to predict future population trends. something that's very helpful for government agencies at all different levels. Demography comes up a lot in government planning. Youth-weighted pyramids reflect past births and predict future growth trends. So when you see a heavy bulge on the bottom of the pyramid indicating lots of youth, and population pyramids with a more cylindrical shape represent countries approaching population stability, or those in demographic decline. So if we go back, we can see some of those representations here, such as China's population with a consistent cylindrical bulge throughout, but a bit of a larger bulge there in the center in comparison to Sun City, Arizona's, with a bulging elderly population, retirees. Next, we'll take a look through the lens of mobility to understand population geography. Very important within mobility, again, this week is migration. There's several reasons for migration that become particularly important for us to look at here. Early human groups moved in response to migration of animals. So geographers, right from paleoanthropology, from prehistoric time, are looking at the way that human groups have moved in through more recent centuries with the development of large cities and how that's affected populations. Also, the agricultural revolution allowed human groups to stop their seasonal migrations. So this had a large effect on how populations were then able to grow. And some groups still migrate in response to environmental collapse in particular. This is very common in the Southwest Pacific right now, environmental refugees having to flee Pacific Islands for countries such as New Zealand or Australia. This can also be in response to religious or ethnic persecution, all in search of better opportunities. Simple nomadic we have for describing these types of factors are push and pull. So unfavorable, repelling conditions being the push, or favorable, attracting being pull factors. So for instance, disease or war would be good examples of push factors, and pull factors might be the better economic benefits of a developed area, or for instance in the Bay Area, lots of people moving for better economic conditions in the Silicon Valley, for instance, although that also in turn becomes a push factor, pushing other people out. We'll look more at that in latter units. Here we see a great world map of the major and minor migration flows today. You can see net population gain from in-migration over on the left or in color bar from 5% to 20%. Countries such as Canada, Australia, Italy, Scandinavian countries. And in contrast, net population loss from out-migration, deep red, 5% upwards of 24% of population leaving. Ireland, Iceland, for instance, standing out there in Northern Europe, Syria as well, in the Middle East. On that note, we can take a look through the lens of globalization at population geography and begin to understand a little bit more about the population explosion, the rapid accelerating increase of world population since about 1650, but especially over the last 115 years. This was a crucial element in this explosion. It's been a steep decline in death rate, particularly with infants and children. So demographers, population geographers are able to track this through time based on historical records. I mean, this has been in most of the world, with an accompanying universal decline in fertility as well. Many areas have dropped in the number of births per woman. Until very recently, the number of people in the world has been increasing geometrically, which we could think of as doubling in shorter and shorter periods of time. We're just beginning to see the beginning of a plateau of these population increases, which demographers project to reach a plateau at about 2050. In another 30 or so years, it's forecasted to be around 9 billion people on Earth, that there could likely be a plateau of the world population then. Here's the population doubling time over the last 12,000 years. This raises the importance of the Malthusian theory. Perhaps some of you remember learning about Thomas Malthus before, and particularly his essay on the principle of population from 1798. He believed that human ability to multiply far exceeded our ability to increase food production. And as well, he regarded famine, disease, and war as inevitable outcome of populations outstripping the food supply. However, there's many flaws in his theories, and unfortunately, it's used in quite politicized arguments still currently that unfortunately are used against poor and economically marginalized, ecologically marginalized people as well. So, an alternative to overpopulation would be the notion of a maldistribution of our food supplies. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels blamed poverty and starvation not on the overpopulation of people, particularly poor people, that Irish immigrants that Thomas Malthus was referring to of the 18th century, which we need to keep in mind the large amount of colonialism and oppression that was going on in Ireland at that time, causing people to have to flee Ireland, come to the more economically developed England. So a more pronounced, refined, and sound explanation was put forward by Karl Marx and Engels in the latter few decades after Malthus. And we can begin to ask ourselves, are starvation, warfare, and disease more the result of maldistribution of the world's wealth than that of overpopulation? So a central question we'll raise throughout the course. Critics of Malthus and his modern day followers point out that although global population has doubled 3 times since the 18th century when Malthus wrote it, food supplies have doubled 5 times, far outpassing world population growth numbers. China's one-child policy is interesting to highlight here, showing a successful top-down policy of reducing population growth, with violators facing huge monetary fines, losing the ability for new housing. So some quite restrictive government policies, and now this policy has been relaxed in most recent 3 years, and Han Chinese families, the ethnic Han people, are able to start having more than one child again. So here you see a propaganda sign, very common throughout China, advertising and promoting the one-child policy. Next, to look at population through the lens of nature culture, you need to consider population's effect on environmental alteration, how people modify their habits through adaptive strategies. For instance, where population density is high, think of Tokyo, Mexico City, building upwards instead of outwards. And it's only a relatively small percentage of Earth populations that controls much of the industrial technology and consumes a disproportionate percentage of the world's resources every year. So for instance, world map here to look at global climate change refugees, kind of illustrating some of that disparity. We can see here different forms of areas being exposed to desertification and drought, areas exposed to hurricanes, particularly in the Southwest Pacific that I mentioned, and how that can influence environmental refugees. Lastly, through cultural landscape, we can look at various forms of development that have corresponded with population geographers' study of the landscape. Farm villages, cluster rural settlements of moderate size. For instance, here's a great picture from the Norse Vikings' original settlement of Iceland, looking very similar to this over the past centuries. And in contrast to some of those cultural landscapes, shanty towns on the periphery of, and even in the inside of many of the world's large cities today. Basic services are often absent, severely lacking. So here you see a picture of the shanty towns from outside of Bogota, Colombia. we can return to some of this in the discussion boards. If you have questions, please post them.